In my last video, I argued that Abraham was not married to his literal blood sister, making his union with Sarah innocent of any charges of incest and in abidance with the laws of Leviticus 18. Now, I've heard some believers before say that whether or not Abraham was in violation of Leviticus 18 is inconsequential because Abraham married Sarah well before those laws were even given. But it is my strong opinion that those believers are not feeling the full weight of what they are saying. They're not feeling the full weight of the problem that causes. And though I spent the last video explaining how Abraham was not married to his sister, I'd like to take a few minutes right now to explain why I think it would have been a sin if Abraham had married his sister, even if the Leviticus 18 law was given to Moses many years after said marriage. I, along with the rest of the majority of Christian history and tradition, hold that the laws and commands of God are not arbitrary edicts, but are principles that reflect the character of God. They are manifestations of God's own innate nature. This necessarily has to be true, because if it wasn't true, all of Christianity, and really all of theism, would cease to be a tenable belief system, since it would fall subject to the Euthyphro dilemma. It's a philosophical criticism about the nature of God and goodness, and the philosophical critique against theism that asks this question: does God command something because it is good, or is something good because God commands it? I'm not going to hash out the entire dilemma here in this episode, just to say that if something is ontologically good on the basis that God commands it, it makes God into a being that commands things arbitrarily. It means that God could say one thing at one time and then say the opposite thing at another time, resulting in a capricious lawgiver, one who speaks with a forked tongue. Now, God could at one point say that ABC is evil and reprehensible, and then turn around at a later time and say that ABC is good and something that he loves. Beyond the fact that this is an arbitrary God who gives self-contradicting commands, it just doesn't sound at all like the God of the Bible in the slightest. The reason you may not have heard about the Euthyphro dilemma is because it has lost its teeth in modern times, because Christians have recognized it's a false dilemma, since there is a third option, and that God commands things consistently. Because the third option is that God commands things in a consistent way because they are reflections of his character. They are edicts that in principle are in line with his innate moral nature. This nullifies the Euthyphro dilemma because it makes the foundation of goodness something that is not outside of God himself, while also revealing that God and his goodness are not arbitrary or ever-changing. This also lines up with many verses in the Bible that speak about God's visceral hatred towards sin and how there are degrees to evil. Some acts of sin are severely more wicked than other acts of sin, which contradicts the notion that each command is an ad hoc declaration. It also is in line with other verses of the Bible that declare the commands of God as perfect, pure, and everlasting. Such adjectives as these cannot be said about edicts which are arbitrary, capricious, and prone to change. Some modern theories about biblical ethics resort to something known as divine command theory. Divine command theory states that no matter what God declares, the fact that it comes from God automatically makes it good. Now, I, personally, am a critic of this theory. I do believe that we can have confirmation that something is good based on God's declarations. But what I'm saying is God declaring to us that something is good is not the sole reason why such a thing is actually good. This subtle distinction I'm making is a distinction between epistemology being the study of knowing, and the difference between that and ontology, which is the study of being. I'm saying that if God declares to humanity that ABC is good, that epistemologically establishes that ABC is good, but it does not ontologically establish that ABC is good. I'm saying that ABC was good even before God confirmed or revealed it to us, because ontologically, ABC is in line with God's nature, which is eternal, whether we were told about it or not. Divine command theory, on the other hand, states that ABC becomes ontologically good the moment God declares it so, but not before. And this falls subject to Euthyphro's critique, as well as a lot of other Bible passages that contradict it. My contention is that if ABC is good, even before God declared it so, then there is something about ABC that is capable of being discovered about its goodness on grounds of reason and intellect, whether God overtly declares it so or not. That doesn't mean it's easy to discover. No, not at all. Just like any endeavor, the field of ethics is a discipline that takes commitment and study in order to plunge its resources. That also doesn't mean that every single edict of good and evil is even capable of being discovered through reason alone. I'm only speaking in regards to these moral laws that are revealed in nature. For those of my audience familiar with the idea of natural theology, I'm referring to natural revelation being discoverable, whereas special revelation is only discoverable by God's unique communication to us, specifically through the Bible. And this discipline of ethical study is immensely helped when God offers to us his laws that give us both special revelation and confirmations for us about natural revelation in regards to what is good and evil. Because this study of ethics is a discipline, it necessarily means that it takes time to grow in knowledge of it. And that time implies a learning curve. Obviously, we are not going to hold less seasoned believers accountable to laws that they are not studied in as much as we are to hold accountable those who are more seasoned in this discipline and who should know better. We do the same with our children. When they grow in wisdom, we place more responsibility on them and hold them to higher standards of behavior than when they were babies. Now, this is also something the Lord does with his people. Jesus tells us that he will hold people accountable proportionately with the knowledge they had. But notice, this is all speaking about our epistemology about morality, our knowledge, right, that we have about morality. And none of this does it change the ontology of the moral law, its essence in existence. Paul confirms this in Romans 5 when he states, "Sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law." Sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. See what I mean when I say incest was still sinful even before God gave the Mosaic Code? Regardless of if it is known or counted against Abraham, it is still objectively a sin nonetheless. A huge theme in Romans is Paul talking about the morality of the law and his relationship to the knowledge of it. Also, in the Old Testament, God promises the people of Israel that the heathen nations surrounding Israel will see the laws of Israel for themselves and be able to recognize that surely this is a good and moral people. Is that not amazing? The people who are the most wicked, who do not have the oracles of God, the heathens surrounding Israel, they will still be able to use their own reasoning to conclude that the laws of the Old Testament are righteous and good, based not on the fact that God declared them, a God who from their perspective, they didn't even believe was real. No, they didn't see the goodness of God's commands on a divine command theory. These pagans, according to the Bible, saw the inherent goodness of it. The Bible says they will still reason and conclude that the Old Testament laws are good and righteous based on the law itself and its own merits. I hope my viewers are appreciating what I'm doing when I'm saying this, because my entire channel is based on this premise. I am taking on a burden of proof that no other apologist is. It's my contention that every single command principle of the law, of the Bible, that comes from God, whether from the New Testament or from the Old Testament Mosaic Code, is good and righteous. And it is good and righteous inherently, meaning It isn't merely good and righteous at only one certain time and place. And I'm saying each of these laws can be argued for in the eyes of non-believers and pagans to the point where even they would agree, based on reason and merit, that these laws are fair and just. I don't rely on divine command theory to interpret the tough Bible passages and then say, well, God commanded it, so we just have to bite the bullet. No, I'm saying God commanded it, and even the pagans will be able to see its moral goodness. I'm not making a modest claim here. I'm making some bold claims. And I'm making them because I believe that's what the Bible teaches. And I've made this entire channel to display that very thing. I've included in my videos the voices of some of the loudest atheists and critics of the Bible to show that their interpretations of the Bible are wrong and unfair based on logical hermeneutics. And I've used their own reasoning to show that they actually agree with the principles of the law that the Bible communicates. Now, I have to address another aspect of the law at this point because I can preemptively anticipate what some of my critics will say. They'll point to verses that speak of the aspects of the Old Testament law passing away. So let me address that concern right now. You've probably noticed that more than once I've said the phrase principles of the law. And you may be wondering what I mean when I say that because I'm very purposeful in that phrase. One of the tenets I'm arguing for about God's law is that it's eternally good. It is not temporary, but universal and eternal, as the Psalms say. And if that's true, then the law of God isn't just a temporary ordinance, but rather it is a moral principle. It is very important to recognize the distinction between legal ordinances and moral principles when it comes to the biblical study. And in this next part, I'm not offering any new interpretation that hasn't already been stated by many theologians before me already, but it's vital to understand now. Many scholars dissect the Old Testament law into sections. Sections like the moral law, the civil code, or the ceremonial law, and so forth. And while I don't disagree with these dissections, I find it's much easier and simpler to understand the law in a different way. And that way is that each command from God in the Mosaic Code has two elements. One is a moral principle, and the other element is a civil ordinance. The difference between the two is crucial because the way the law is written is via case law. The law of God uses case examples with civil ordinances as the means to communicate the moral principle therein. It's not always easy to identify where the civil ordinance ends and where the moral principle begins, and that ability to distinguish where one ends and one begins comes with more discipline in the study of ethics. But that you pursue an understanding of difference between ordinance and principle is vital, because I'm not saying that the civil ordinances themselves are the inherently eternal element that reflects God's character. The case law elements are those ordinances. Those ordinances are simply the mechanisms that God uses to communicate the deeper principle to us. And it is that principle that is communicated which does carry universal applicability and eternal weight. It's a similar difference as the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. My contention is that when Jesus or Paul or God the Father teach about the eternal goodness of the law, they are talking about those moral principles. The moral principles and the spirit of the Mosaic Code is the law. The ordinances are tailored to the culture and the time of the people they are addressed to, meaning those ordinances may change, but the principles they communicate do not change. The spirit of the law is the pure, perfect, and everlasting part, regardless of what the ordinances are that are used to communicate them. An example is an order. The law of the Mosaic Code in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4 states that you are not to muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain. Now let's go over what we just learned and apply it to this law. There is a civil ordinance element to this law and a moral principle element as well. The civil ordinances about this law are the literal ox, the muzzle, and the grain bin that the ox treads out. But now let's ask, what is the principle? Can we identify it? Well, Paul does. Paul tells us what the principle is when he extrapolates it in 1 Timothy 5, when he says elders and preachers are to receive financial compensation for their labors. What Paul did was extrapolate the moral principle from the ordinances of the ox and the grain bin, and then proceeded to apply that principle to a different set of ordinances, namely the office of elder and its teaching function, to argue that the office should be financially compensated, because the principle of the law, the spirit of the law, is that a laborer is not to be denied the fruits of his own labor. That's the principle. That's the eternal moral law of Deuteronomy 25:4. Not the ox, not the muzzle. It's that the fruits of his own labor should not be denied him. That's the eternal moral principle of Deuteronomy 25:4, still being relevant and being applied by Paul himself in the New Testament age to his current situation and set of ordinances. Any church that financially compensates their teaching elders is living by and fulfilling the law of Moses in the command at Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, to this day, according to Paul himself. My whole point is that this process we've just gone through can and should be done with every single command coming from the Mosaic Code. Paul says that the ordinances can and do pass away, such as in Ephesians, especially considering that Jesus kept and fulfilled those principles and ordinances. But Paul also continues to teach the principles of the law despite the ordinances passing away, because the law still is the compass for living righteously, for living a sanctified life, for living a life that is pleasing to God, for living in a way that is showing our thanks and gratitude towards God's gift to us in Christ. Now here's the kicker. I've labored that the spirit of the law and its moral principle is the true essence of the law and is universally enduring and applicable even to the present day. And I've also stated that the ordinances that were used in the Old Testament to communicate those principles, as important as they are, can and do change from culture to culture. They can be temporary without undermining the law itself, because they are not the essence of what the law is communicating. That being said, God would not, could not command those ordinances if those ordinances were evil. In other words, even in the ordinances God commands, as temporary as they are, they still can be trusted to be good and reliable mechanisms for fulfillment, and we know this epistemologically because God used them to communicate to us. So even though Christians today in the modern age don't have to use those same ordinances to abide by the principles of the law, if they have any doubt or hesitancy about how to fulfill the law, they can use the training wheels that those ordinances represent, and it wouldn't be wrong. Now, it may mean those Christians are rudimentary in their understanding of the law, and God calls us to grow in wisdom, to go from milk to meat, but that doesn't mean that there's anything inherently wrong with milk. So another example is in place to communicate this. The Old Testament law forbids in its ordinances the eating of things like shrimp. My contention is that the ordinance of not eating shrimp was a mechanism for Israel to live by so they could be taught the deeper principle about remaining holy, separate, and sanctified as a chosen people in the land God gave them. Now, when Peter is presented with similar foods, God says he can eat it because it is not inherently unclean. The idea is that the ordinary mechanism of refraining from shrimp was temporary, but the principle of remaining holy and sanctified as a people of God is the enduring principle that still applies. That's why Peter, or any Christian in the modern age, can partake of a shrimp meal while also not being in violation of that law. Now, what if someone disagrees with me on that? What if someone has doubts about that? What if someone is slightly unsure about where the ordinance of that law ends and where the principle of that law begins? And they may have weaker or more sensitive consciences concerning such things, And if that's so, they would not be wrong to continue refraining from shrimp, because that was the ordinance specifically endorsed by God as a mechanism for fulfilling that command as it was given to the Israelites. I think that ordinance is not binding on the conscience of a Christian, but I still think it can properly be used as a training wheel if Christians so choose to continue using it as such in order to still abide by the moral principle of the law, its deeper spiritual aspect. All right, now let's get back to Abraham and Sarah. At the beginning of all this, I stated that even though the law of Leviticus 18 was given after Abraham had married, that I believe it still would have been sinful for Abraham if he had married his literal blood sister. As I've already quoted Paul saying that sin definitely did exist even before the law was given, it just wasn't counted against anyone. Obviously, some sins were definitely counted against people, especially sins that violated laws that can be known through natural law, such as the sin of murder. We see that in Cain's example. But still, overall, the guilt is less for those who commit sin in ignorance versus those who know the law well. And I grant now, as I also granted in previous episode, that it's technically possible for God to have blessed Abraham with a child in an incestuous union. It's just difficult for me to take that idea that Abraham didn't understand the same principle of morality that even pagans understand without the aid of the Bible, namely, that it is a repulsive thing to marry one's own sister. I don't think many people in the modern age or in the ancient world needed a Bible to tell them that. And furthermore, God certainly knows that incest is a sin, even before he gave the law to Moses. And for God to choose this incestuous union, so-called incestuous union, as the foundation of his chosen nation is also a difficult thing to accept, which is why I offered that alternative understanding in the last video. But me saying something is difficult to accept is not the same thing as saying it is logically impossible to accept. I grant that. And as much as I don't like the idea of Abraham marrying his sister, I still leave room for the possibility that it might have occurred if I am presented with a well-reasoned argument that the alternative that I offered is insufficient. But now that I've shown my openness to the possibility that God chose incest in that case, let me shift to another scenario and raise the stakes. Because in the case of Adam and Eve's children, I am not open at all to the idea that God chose incest as the means to propagate humanity. In the case of Adam and Eve's children, while it is ever so popular for every Christian preacher and teacher to conjecture that Adam and Eve's children engaged in incest, I can't accept that notion in the least because I don't see any room at all for such a thing to take place because I think it's logically impossible. There is a major difference between the case of Abraham and Sarah and the case of Adam and Eve. And that case is this. Let's assume that Abraham did marry his literal sister. And if that's so, it can always be said about Abraham that he didn't have to choose to marry his sister. And in saying that when I say that Abraham didn't have to marry his literal sister, that absolves God from being accused of forcing any sin on Abraham, and all the blessings that God gave Abraham could be said to be in spite of Abraham's sinfulness, not because of it. Now, I don't think that's how it was. No, I think Abraham was faithful in his actions. There was no incest to be found in his union with Sarah. But now let's look at the case of Adam and Eve. When God gives the command for Adam and Eve, and by extension all of humanity, to be fruitful and multiply, and then you have pastors say that Adam and Eve's children find themselves in a scenario where there is no other humans to marry outside of their own siblings, and that the only way that they can fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply is to violate other commands about not committing incest. What those pastors are saying about that scenario is that God forced Adam and Eve's family into incest. And I, for one, reject that notion. I think that's a logical impossibility to say that about God. It's impossible to say that God, knowing that incest is evil, forced such evil on the family of Adam, regardless of whether Adam's family knew if incest was right or wrong. I mean, they did. Because that would be God forcing humanity into what God knows is wickedness. That's completely contrary to everything the Bible says about how God treats wickedness and treats his people. No, I don't believe that happened at all. And I'm more convicted, much more convicted, that Cain and Abel did not engage in incest, more than I'm convicted that Abraham did not engage in incest. And I'm going to lay out the details of those convictions and why I hold them in my next video.